Welcome to the Christian faith in 100 objects, and to think together this morning about what it means to be human. And with that provocative question at the top there, the heading. Excuse me. Sorry, I left my desktop on with the microphone coming through. With that question at the top of our discussion, are human beings different from other animals? It's just a good way of getting the discussion going. And well, ask it to your friends. We've just finished filming some new Sycamore films about the Christian faith, and we've got a great series of discussion questions at the end. And this is one of the discussion questions that everyone has an opinion about. So a really interesting topic. What's the answer? Well, let me say straight out of the gate, I think most people would say yes, but, or it depends what you mean by different. Yes, human beings are human beings. We are what we are. We're not other animals. We're distinctive and we're different. But how different, and where do the differences lie? And to sum up the Christian understanding, certainly from the Catholic perspective, we have so much in common with the creation, with the animal world, with different animals. But there is something quite fundamentally distinct and unique about human beings. And this is what we want to explore. Where is that distinctiveness? What is that uniqueness? And to say that there's two extremes to avoid, obviously, this is kind of boring and a truism. But just to say at the beginning, to avoid the extreme of thinking that we're just the same, or to say that we're completely different and there's nothing in common. These have been options or temptations historically, but somehow we need to find a middle way of having things in common, but recognizing the distinctiveness. And in fact, this is how the Bible understands human life, as well as good science and good philosophy, I believe. So it's a good example of how when things are done well and sensitively, there doesn't need to be a clash between science and faith. They can complement each other. They can grow together in truth and shed light on each other. Let's think it through together. Clearly, we have so much in common with other animals. We're part of the created world. We are made of matter. We are not just spiritual creatures like the angels. We have so much in common in terms of our natures, our being, our abilities, our characteristics, our genetics. Maybe in the past, some philosophers and some Christians would have been a little bit naive and said, oh yes, human beings are different and unique. Oh yes, look, we have reason and creativity and language, as if these things are completely absent from other animals. But no, in the last few decades especially, but also many centuries back, we've been aware of the amazing knowledge that other animals have, their intelligence in different ways, the creativity, the way that some animals use tools, the way that they build community, the way that they communicate in what seems to be symbols and signs and almost languages, the way animals love and care for one another with compassion, with kinds of friendship, the way they mourn, the way they deliberate and seem to choose between different options. It's not possible anymore just to say naively, look at human beings who are conscious thinking beings and as if other animals are just machines, which is simply not true. The wonder of the animal kingdom and the wonder of the intelligence and creativity of animals. So it might be tempting with that in mind to say, oh yeah, there's just a spectrum. There's no fundamental differences, but there's just a spectrum. It's worth noting the different kinds of changes. So forget animal life and human beings for a minute. There's different kinds of changes. You can have, in any system or categorization, you can have little changes, incremental changes, adjustments, tweaks, or you can have a change that we might call radical or transformative, a step change, people talk about disruptive innovation. They talk about incremental innovation. You keep making something slightly better, or disruptive innovation when you have something radically new come along. Or other words for this, continuous versus discontinuous, or quantitative versus qualitative. So some people would say, some scientists, some biologists, that the differences between the incredible diversity of the animal kingdom and the human being are simply incremental differences. There's like a sliding scale, and we can dial up a little bit more the intelligence and the creativity and the communication skills and the compassion. We can just dial it up as we go through the different grades and hierarchies of animals. And then when we get to human beings, we can just dial it up a little bit more, maybe a lot more. But the changes are simply incremental. And in fact, another position, this would be the Christian one, but another legitimate scientific position, is to say, actually, there's something qualitatively new. There is a connection, there is a change, there is a growth, but with the emergence of human beings, there is something fundamentally new and distinctive, not just a greater quantity of a certain capacity, not just a sliding scale, but something qualitatively new, a radical change. And this is the Christian understanding, the biblical understanding, but it's also part of the understanding of much of science, of recognizing that something new is happening. There's so much in common, but there are still qualities that put us, as it were, into a distinctive class of animal, a new type of being. Traditionally, in philosophy, going right back to Aristotle, to simplify, one definition here is that the human being is a rational animal. So rationality was a summary word to say, what are all these distinctively new characteristics about the human being? And I just list a few here. And again, it doesn't mean that in some ways these qualities are completely absent from other intelligent, creative animals. It doesn't mean that, but it does mean that there is a new level of reality, of life, of being here. Just a list of a few things where we can look into in more detail, if we want to. Freedom, human freedom. Some animals definitely choose and deliberate, but there's a kind of freedom in the human being of making fundamental decisions, of reforming our mind and our way of thinking, of going beyond instinct into a kind of self-determination, almost a kind of self-creation. We are deciding not just whether to do X, Y, or Z, but who to become, what goals to seek, where our life is taking us. Freedom and self-determination. Creativity. Of course, animals are creative, but there is a new level of creativity in human beings. We see not just signs and patterns, but art and creativity and new ideas. It's symbolized by the emergence of art, symbolic art, representative art, abstract art. There are little hints of this in some animal behaviors, but just the radical explosion of art and imagination and creativity when human beings come on the scene. This is possibly connected with language. Again, animals communicate, they have signs and symbols. Chimpanzees can learn a huge list of words. Birds have an incredible vocabulary, I was hearing on the radio this week. But the ability to use and manipulate and change language, the ability to use grammar, to have a deep grammar, to share ideas, to express what's within us, to communicate to the inner life of another person. The level of language with human beings is something new and distinctive. We can go back to Aristotle and speak about rationality, not just intelligence or cleverness. Animals are very clever, but the ability to think and reason in abstract ways. This is one way of describing it. Abstract thinking. take our impressions of the world, to internalize them, to create them symbolically in our minds, in language, in abstract thinking, and then to reform them into the world so that our abstract thinking is changing what we do and how we live. The ability to speculate and think, and especially the ability to speculate and think about abstract, metaphysical, philosophical, religious things. We're not just dealing with food and survival and getting our umbrella out when it's raining and relationships. We're dealing with profound philosophical questions, all of us, not just the great philosophers. And in fact, anthropologists and sociologists would recognize that one of the distinctive features of being human is our religious sense. The fact that we're searching for a meaning beyond the everyday. The fact that we are religious beings by nature. Religion isn't a sign of regression. In fact, religion is part of the emergence of human beings, it seems, historically. Our moral sense, not just to choose, but to choose right from wrong, and a feeling that there is an obligation, a moral obligation to live in a certain way, that we are beholden to a law, a moral law, a right or wrong, that our actions are part of a bigger order. And something very important to me because of my studies when I was doing my research was the idea of self-consciousness. I don't think many people would deny that animals, the dog sitting in the corner of the living room here, is conscious. There's that dog looking out at you. It seems to be thinking and deliberating, and there is a consciousness. But self-consciousness, to be aware of our own thinking, to be able to reflect on ourselves and on our thinking, and to step back and make judgments and to be free because of that self-consciousness and that self-reflection. So much here, really a long list. I could go on, we could go into any of these things, but just here are some of the qualities that seem to be not just quantitatively different, like a bit more intelligence, a bit more freedom, but that with all the connections we have, there is something radically new here, a new being, a new way of being, with our freedom, our creativity, our language, our rationality, our morality, our religious sense, our self-consciousness. Something new has happened. We're used to this in science. The branches of science. Of course, chemistry relates to physics. Of course it does. But something new is happening with chemistry that you can't just explain in terms of physics. Of course, biology is related to chemistry. Of course it is. You can't do biology without doing chemistry. But chemistry alone can't account for this new level of reality, which is life. And the point here is that with the emergence of human beings, we can't just say, oh, here is another animal. Something new has happened. We are animals. We need to refer back to biology and zoology. But in technical terms, there is a new reality here that needs understanding. We call it anthropology. We move from chemistry to biology, to zoology and animal life, and now we need to understand human beings in terms of anthropology. What does it mean to be human? So all of this, I'm speculating with you. I haven't talked very much about the religious view, but this understanding fits with the biblical, the Christian view of human beings. The fact that we have so much in common, but there is something new and distinctive about the human person. So in the Bible and in Catholic philosophy and theology, we speak about the spiritual soul of the human being as well as the body, that we are creatures of body and soul. And the spiritual nature of the human person is what helps us to understand this radical change, this elevation, this leap. Put it another way, you can't understand these distinctive, unique qualities of the human being purely in terms of matter and body and the material. The freedom, the creativity, the language, the self-consciousness, they require a spiritual element to the human person, that we are not just bound by the determinism of matter, that mind and consciousness and self-consciousness is something more than just the material. We're body and soul, and this is one of the elements of the Christian understanding. So we look back to the book of Genesis at the beginning of the Bible. And of course, this is not a scientific textbook, a historical book of history, but it does contain theological truth about the nature of God and the creation and human beings. A key line is Genesis 2, verse 7. The Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. It's so important for the connection of Christian faith with science, because this line allows us to see that Adam is formed from the dust of the earth, from pre-existing material. So yes, we are connected with the world. We're part of creation. And the second half of the sentence, that God breathes life into him, that he is a unique creation, that human beings are uniquely created by God. The hand of God, providence, is in our origins, the origin of the human race, the origin of each human being at our conception, because of the spiritual reality of our souls with the material reality of our bodies, that we are body and soul. We are a single being, a single person of body and soul. And this is a scientific reality, and it is a biblical reality. And we see that the observations of science about human uniqueness and the teaching of the scriptures come hand in hand here. So to sum up the Catholic Christian understanding, we are human persons, body and soul, corporeal and spiritual. We are from the dust of the earth. Our origin is partly explained by the natural processes of life and creation, and yes, of evolution. But we are created in a unique way because of the gift of God in giving us our spiritual souls. And we are created for friendship with one another, for friendship with God, and ultimately to share in the very life of God, that we have an immortal, eternal destiny. And because of this balance, we're from the earth, but we're created by God uniquely as well. It allows us to speculate, what does it mean to be part of creation? It allows us to say, how can we emerge from pre-existing matter? The extraordinary processes. It doesn't take away from the fact that God created the world, that he created the laws of nature, that he's guiding the processes of the universe, that he's working through natural processes, what philosophy calls secondary causes. This is his providence. But we also see how God is breathing life into the first human beings, that we're not simply part of the process of evolution, because God has a special plan for us, and he steps into the world in a very special way with the beginning of human origins and with the beginning of each human life. So let's just look finally into, because many of you will be asking very concrete questions. Well, what can the church accept about evolution? Where is the overlap between the biblical and the Christian understanding and the church's understanding of evolution? To quote from the Catechism, the church teaches that every spiritual soul is created immediately by God. It is not produced by the parents, and also that it is immortal. It does not perish when it separates from the body at death. and it will be reunited with the body at the final resurrection. It was Pope Pius XII, so decades ago, the middle of the 20th century, who recognized the role of science as it, quote, inquires into the origin of the human body as coming from pre-existent and living matter. So Pius XII, many, many years ago, recognizing, open to the possibility of evolution as part of an explanation for the origin and the evolution of the human body, but not as a complete explanation of the emergence of human life, because that would rule out the spiritual soul and the spiritual reality of human life. John Paul II in 1996 went further and said that evolution is more than a hypothesis. It's part of our understanding of human origins now, but it shouldn't become an ideology that limits the human being to just a bodily reality. Because, quoting John Paul II, we find with man, with human beings, we find ourselves facing a different ontological order, an ontological leap, meaning a new kind of reality, a passage into the spiritual realm that cannot be observed simply by scientific methods, by the theory of evolution. Although we can discern through research the valuable signs of what is specifically human life, but the experience of metaphysical knowledge, of self-consciousness, of self-awareness, of moral conscience, of freedom, of aesthetic and religious experience, basically, to sum up John Paul II, you need more than just biology and evolutionary theory to account for these incredible human characteristics. So as Catholic Christians, yes, we can be open to good science and evolution as long as it doesn't become a materialist ideology. As long as evolutionary theory doesn't become non-science. In other words, a scientist should do good science and explore everything that can be explored, but not claim in an ideological way to be able to answer every question about the world, the universe, or human life. Evolutionary theory can explore human origins. It can look at the material side of human origins, as long as it's not pretending that there is no such thing as divine providence, because we understand God's providence to be part of the creation. And as long as it's not pretending that there is no radical newness in human life, because we recognize from science and from philosophy and from our Christian faith and our biblical faith that there is something beautifully, radically, fundamentally new with the emergence of human life. And we believe as Christians, not just because of our faith, but because of Christian philosophy, that this can only be explained in terms of the spiritual soul of the human person. And to quote finally from the International Theological Commission, that was writing, connecting with what Pope John Paul II had been saying. Quote, Catholic theology affirms that the emergence of the first members of the human species, whether as individuals or in populations, represents an event that is not susceptible of a purely natural explanation, and which can appropriately be attributed to divine intervention. And with respect to the immediate creation of the human soul, Catholic theology affirms that particular actions of God bring about effects that transcend the capacity of created causes acting according to their natures. To put it much more simply, we can learn so much from the wisdom of science and evolutionary theories in terms of understanding human origins, but we can't understand everything. Science will explain so much, but we need science and philosophy and faith to fully understand the origin of the human race and the origin of each human person. And we believe that part of that is the work of God in creating the human race, working through the natural processes, through the evolutionary processes, but stepping in to bring the spiritual soul to our first parents and to each human being, so that we are a unity of body and soul. We can be understood and explained in terms of natural causes and in terms of the marvelous work of God in his universe. Good. So I hope I've, as always, tried to do too much in a short space of time, but it's got you thinking. You can read more in the Catechism. And what is my object to finish with? Well, I'm cheating a little bit here. My object is a cave that I've never been to. In fact, it's a series of caves. The caves of Lascaux in France. These are the caves that contain the prehistoric cave paintings that were painted by our human ancestors about 19,000 years ago in beautiful pigments of orange and red and ochre. There are images of horses and stags and bulls and many other animals. And in the caves of Lascaux, there is a single figure of a human person. We don't know what they meant to those who created them, but they say something about the wonder of creation, the wonder of the human spirit, and the uniqueness that is part of what it means to be human. They're closed to visitors now. It would be one of my absolute dreams to have the privilege of going into those caves sometime, but I don't think it's ever going to be possible. And I'll put some links to some pictures and even some videos onto the description here on YouTube. Thanks for being with me. Back tomorrow and in fact tonight for some ways of praying if you're watching live. Take care.